Artist to Artist, take 4. We are in Brooklyn, and we're here with Nathan, and I'm just gonna let him take it and introduce himself. So, just tell us a little bit about yourself and what you're known for.
Cool. So my name is Nathan Yungerberg. I am a photographer, playwright, and originally from the Midwest, but I've been living in New York for almost 10 years now. Consider Minneapolis as my home, but New York is kind of my second home now. And just here doing my thing and taking advantage of all the opportunities that exist for artists here and just trying to make it happen.
So, making that transition, how old were you when that happened? And just tell me a little bit about like that whole transition to coming to New York and.
Sure. Yeah. So I was in my mid-30s when I moved here. I had been running a modeling agency that I had co-founded with a friend for 10 years prior to that. And I say that I kind of reached the early midlife crisis, which I actually call midlife awakening now. I try not to use that word crisis anymore. But I was definitely going through something like I'd hit the ceiling in that city, and I just needed to kind of shake things up. And so I'd always anticipated moving here, but I hadn't planned on doing it until I was 40. That was my big plan.
Okay.
So I came, what, 5, 6 years earlier. It wasn't really such a big deal. Like a lot of people hear that I'm from Minneapolis, and they're like, "Oh, it must have been such a difficult transition for you," but Minneapolis is obviously a lot smaller, but it's actually very cosmopolitan. There's a lot of people, immigrants from all over the world that have been moving there specifically from East and West Africa and Southeast Asia. So I'd already been kind of, familiar with different types of cultures and foods and things like that, and dealing with all different types of people. I think probably the biggest change for me was just dealing with the rent here, because that was like such a huge shock. But because there were so many more opportunities as a photographer, my income increased so much that everything kind of evened out. So that within a very short amount of time made things a lot easier. And from the first month that I was here, I lived in Harlem the first year that I was here, I was completely head over heels in love with New York City.
Wow.
And so that made the transition a lot easier. And I'd also been dealing with agents in New York City, and this was kind of the market that my agency worked with the most, because we managed and placed fashion models, so we'd find people there and send them all over the world, and New York was like the primary market that we dealt in. And we'd had several employees that had since moved on and were working at big modeling agencies here in the city, so it was the place that we always came to when we needed to go somewhere for work. So I'd been coming out here for 10 years prior to even moving, so it was very familiar in a way, I guess. Yeah.
So Harlem to Brooklyn, which borough would you prefer?
I'm one of those people who it's literally like my love for both is like straight down the middle. I know there's a lot of kind of loyalty between Brooklyn and Harlem, and people get in fights and whatnot. I have a lot of my artistic friends, especially in the theater community, live in Harlem, but whenever I have to go up there for events or whatnot, I still feel that connection. And it was important for me to have spent some time there, just because of my interest in Harlem Renaissance and all the books I was reading before I moved, and that was really exciting for me. But I think going forward, I've been in Brooklyn now for over 8 years. I was only in Harlem for 1 year, so Brooklyn is, I think, probably where I'm going to stay until I eventually transition, away from New York City, if that happens. But I love both of them. They're just different.
So if you do leave next year, New York, as you said, where are you looking at to go?
I'm kind of moving into that phase now, as I'm moving into my mid-40s, and I'm feeling like the whole reality of like space and a house and green and yard and trees and that kind of stuff, which is where I come from, is starting to whisper to me loudly. And I knew that was probably going to happen eventually. I don't know that I'll ever leave New York completely. I would love to keep, my apartment and maybe get a house somewhere else. And I don't know, maybe it'll be back in the Midwest or upstate New York or something like that. I think I just want to find a place where I feel at home, where I can still be near or in an artistic community, because that's really, really important. So I'm not just going to rush out to the suburbs in Jersey somewhere, Connecticut, and live in an area that's like void of that, because I think I would probably die.
Wow. if you can give yourself, like, if you can go back and give yourself like words of wisdom, what would they be?
God, that's a tough question. I think first to flip that a little bit, I would really applaud myself. Like I made some really amazing decisions when I was like very young, you know, starting in this industry like 25 years ago as a photographer, and um, making choices that people criticized and said that weren't possible. But I was very stubborn at that time, and so I oftentimes will do that. I will kind of look back in time and really just applaud and embrace that 19-year-old me, because the decisions that I made, the choices I made at that time are still sustaining me to this day as I'm here now and, you know, almost 44, like living in New York City. And that's always been huge for me. I think as far as words of wisdom, I would probably really try to speak to my younger self about the art of patience. I think as artists, a lot of us tend to get really impatient, and we get these ideas that kind of start as seeds inside of us, and we want to see the fruition of them like immediately. And there were many things that I did kind of touch in my younger years that would blossom quickly, but now that I'm older and have been living in this creative world for so long, I'm realizing that there are some things that just take a longer amount of time to prosper. And I think if you want them to blossom properly, you really have to breathe through it. Because it's like, you know, giving birth. I always use that analogy, and sometimes the birth takes longer, and you have to really be patient with that. And there are many times, even now or in the last few years, where I've just been like banging my head against the wall because things are not happening the way that I want them to. But I also look at things now in a different way, because I'm moving into this next cycle of my life, and I see things from more of a perspective of the long road now, rather than just, oh, I gotta get this done in the next couple of years before I turn 30 or before I turn 40. Now it's like, okay, cool, you know, where am I gonna be in the next 20 years? Like, what do I wanna be doing in the next 30 years, you know? So patience is the key.
What would you think you'd be doing in the next 10 years?
I think ideally, in, I'm not going to say perfect world because I don't believe that exists, but in the world of my creation, manifesting the world that I would be comfortable to exist in 10 years, when I'll be, you know, pushing mid-50s, I would love to have my playwriting career be substantial. I'd love to be in a place where I could be traveling around the world in different parts, regional markets in the US, actually attending productions and participating in the process of you know, creating theater. I'm also really interested in, as I kind of moving into probably my 60s, returning to my photography, but in a different way. Now, you know, I've been doing actor headshots and model photography for the last 25 years, and I'm ready to kind of put that to the side for a while, and I would love to move into more kind of photojournalistic work. I have some ideas for some books that I would like to do, maybe get some grant money, and these, outside of the playwriting, the photography projects would be more kind of just passion oriented. I really would like to find a way to kind of get these ideas out of my head, but I wouldn't necessarily do that career-wise. I would just do it for the sake of having something to do that would be enjoyable for me at that time in my life. So.
Sounds interesting. When I came up, I saw a couple of images that you've taken on the wall, and you were starting to tell me about when you took those and what were they for. So I guess just explain a little bit about what those images were and what you did them for.
Yeah, so I've done a lot of traveling over the last probably 15 years globally. Brazil, specifically Bahia and the city of Salvador, which is like the black capital of Brazil, is kind of like a second home to me. So I had 2 photos on my wall that were taken on that trip. And the photos that I take when I travel aren't necessarily like travel photography or photojournalistic. They're just kind of my travel shots, but I think just because I'm a professional photographer, they just kind of come out a certain way, but I don't necessarily go on those trips with the whole idea in mind that I'm going to take these brilliant pictures and I'm being a photojournalist or whatever. But I do enjoy that when I travel, and so a few years back I submitted for a selection process for a 100th anniversary celebration of Gordon Parks' life, that they did in Manhattan. I got into that showing, and so for the first time ever, I had to kind of get some pieces matted and framed so that they could be part of this exhibit. And I think there was like maybe 15 to 20 photographers, including myself, that participated in this. And that was a whole new game for me, and I found it really inspiring and exciting to have people actually coming in and look at my work on a wall and get an instant reaction from them, which is completely different than the work that I do with models. Completely different. And I got really excited and filled with like a new energy participating in that. So that's more along the lines, I think, what I would like to transition into down the road.
That's very interesting. So as far as, I guess, marketing or just like really getting stuff put out there, like what forms of social media are you using to push that?
I'd like to say that I'm really social media savvy, and I actually have a startup that relates to the child modeling industry, scouting and whatnot, where I really do a lot of aggressive social media on that, between Instagram and Facebook. I don't have a Twitter account. I don't have a Tumblr page. I don't do any of those other things. And I actually just converted my personal Facebook page into a business page for my playwriting, and I also have one for photography, but I really don't do a lot with it. I've been kind of having a lot of moments lately as I'm moving in, to my 25th year of shooting, where I see kind of the decline of client base with that, because there's a younger, more energetic, motivated crew of people that actually female photographers that are coming in from LA who will travel all over the country, and they are like Instagram queens. They'll post these things and they get tons of people to go and shoot with them, and I realized a few years ago that that was going to be the death of my business, and so I kind of just surrendered to that and realized that I come to the point where I was kind of in my twilight years of that aspect of the industry, and that I wasn't going to reinvent myself to put extra energy into that, because I knew that within a year or two that I will be exiting from that. So I think it's crucial, though. Anyone that's getting into it now, I think it's imperative that you have some sort of social media presence, because it's virtually free, and it's such a great way to get your name out there. So I've learned a lot about what I didn't do. Yeah.
So going along the lines of more so the playwriting, what started that, or what made you want to get into that, and what pushed it to actually, like really give birth to something that was something that you felt you were going to be able to do?
Yeah, long story, I'll try to make it short. I was traveling through Southeast Asia when I turned 30. That was the gift for myself. I took myself on this trip, and this would have been in 2001. And I had bought a CD in Thailand, a bootleg CD on Khao San Road, and I was listening to this song as I was traveling in a tour bus going out of Bangkok into Malaysia. And I remember I heard this song, and it was like one of the most profound creative experiences that I've ever had, because I literally saw this full-blown, full-color movie of this musical that erupted from the song that I was listening to, and I kept listening to it over and over. And it really blew me away. And it was very clear to me at that moment that whatever this image was that I saw and I felt, that I needed to somehow find a way to bring that into the physical through manifesting it somehow. I didn't quite understand exactly what my responsibility would be at that time. So every few years it would kind of pop up again, and I'd listen to the song, or some characters would dance throughout my mind. But then I always thought that I was going to be involved more from the capacity of a producer. I had no interest in writing at that point in time. I'd been involved in theater as an actor years prior. But then when I moved to New York and I started going to a lot of theatrical events and just immersing myself in Broadway and off-Broadway and off-Broadway, a bell like literally went off one day like 5-6 years ago, and it was like, okay, it's time for you to do this, and the message was very clear that you have to write it. And I was like, oh God, are you serious? Because I didn't know anything about writing a play, But I've always challenged myself with taking on projects that exist in a realm that I know nothing about, you know, like opening a modeling agency or whatever, not taking classes and doing that, just kind of jumping into it. So I was also very clear that I wasn't supposed to study, I wasn't supposed to read anything about playwriting. I read a bunch of biographies and autobiographies, and then I literally just one day started writing, and it just flowed like I had turned on a faucet. And the feeling that I got was so pleasurable, and it reminded me of what I used to feel like when I started shooting like 20-some years ago when I was younger. And then that switch just got flipped on, and I was like, okay, sign me up. And then I had to find a way to just kind of navigate through this industry that was completely alien to me. Thankfully, New York City has a very strong Black theater community, which a lot of people compare to kind of like the Harlem Renaissance, because there's all these people that kind of converge on New York City at this, the same place at the same time, and that industry was very nurturing and supportive to me. So it was basically like I would present myself to a group and start going to events, and they would just be like, "Come on in, we've been waiting for you. Let's work together." And there's been a lot of really great Black theater festivals, like 48 Hours in Harlem that I participated in, and the new Black Fest, and also the Fire This Time Festival, and just amazing people, And that really helped me kind of get my grounding as I've kind of like still trying to navigate myself through this industry that still doesn't really make sense to me, but it's been great.
So where could we find more of your work for the writing?
Well, I have a website. My work is not available on there, but I do keep a news or event section on there where you can be updated on kind of what I'm doing. And that's NathanYungerberg.com, and it's YUNGERBERG.com. I don't have anything coming up in the near future, but whenever I do have an event, I'll usually go ahead and post it on there.
So as far as, I guess, another artist that you admire or someone that's inspired you, who would that be?
Oh, Gordon Parks, like hands down. Like I have very few idols in my world. Not that I don't believe in that, but Gordon Parks was someone who, from when I was in my, I think, early 20s, I wanted to be him. I wanted to emulate his career path. And interestingly enough, like I never knew, well, not even so, because I guess a lot of people have admitted to this too. I had never heard of him before until I was maybe like 24, 25. He actually lived in St. Paul, Minnesota for a while, way back in the day, and that's kind of part of his story if you've ever read any of his books. And so I saw once years ago, I was 24, 25, when I had my modeling agency, there was a library across the street, and I saw a little article in the newspaper saying that this guy who had this crazy hair, Gordon Parks, was going to be speaking about his life, and that he had spent some time in St. Paul where he learned to do fashion photography, and then he became, the first photographer to shoot for American Vogue. And I was like, damn, who is this person, and why have I never heard of him? So I went there with my business partner, and we met him. He was in his 90s at that time. And then I started reading about his biographies, and I love the fact that he basically would follow his impulses and do what he needed to do when it was time to do that. So he did the photography, and then he decided he wanted to make films, and then he wanted to be a composer. And I love that idea of kind of illustrating your life as a Renaissance man or woman. I think that is the richest way to live. And so I'm really trying to incorporate that into my life now, where I don't necessarily have to be just a playwright or just a photographer. It's like I'm a Renaissance man. Like there's all these different things that I want to do. So yeah, hands down Gordon Parks. Like I always recommend to mentees that they really need to get, who are interested in working in the arts, is to get their hands on any of his autobiographies, because they're just so inspirational. What he was able to do at that time as a Black man is just phenomenal. So.
Latest books. I see a lot of books around here. So the
God.
last 2 books you've read or are currently reading.
Well, as I'm glancing over here right now, I'm reading a book called Let's Go Crazy, which is a biography about the making of Purple Rain. Because I'm from Minneapolis, I'm fascinated with that time period back in the late 70s and the early to mid 80s, which I wasn't living there at that time, but I have a lot of mentors who participated in that era actually working for Prince out at Paisley Park when they mentioned them in the book, which is really exciting. So that's been an interesting read. I'm trying to think if I have. Oh, I just read a really beautiful book called Widow Basquiat, which was written about this woman, I forget her last name, I think it's Suzanne something or other, who was actually like one of Basquiat's main girlfriends at that time when he was still alive. And that book was extremely moving and poetic, and I'm extremely fascinated with that era as well, which was another time period that I just kind of like missed, you know, because obviously none of that stuff existed when I got here to New York. But I like to read about those time periods. It really helps me with the stories that I create and kind of gives me a sense of kind of, you know, the ghosts of these things that have gone before me in places where I'm living.
So how or where do you go to get inspired?
You know, definitely traveling. I don't travel on the big trips as much as I used to. Going to Cuba in December, I'm really excited about that. So I'll be there for 3 weeks. Super excited about that. And I'm actually working on a play that's set in Westchester in the 50s about an African American family, and the husband becomes seduced into, like, not necessarily Santeria religion, but like Cuban Santeria music through a friend that owns a Latin jazz record shop. And so I'm really excited to immerse myself in the cultural scene there with the conga, because there's a lot to do with the conga in my play, so that's going to be really exciting. But I think while I'm here in New York, I walk a lot. I think that's one thing that still gives me that sense of like those New York moments, just being a transplant, is just walking around and even on the subway, just observing people and listening to conversations and picking up on little bits and pieces of dialogue that sometimes I will actually use in a play or may actually be the seed of a play, and listening to music. I don't do a lot of major things to get inspired. My process is pretty quiet and simple. So.
Okay. Any advice you would give someone trying to start out now and get into anything that's from photography to writing to...
The biggest advice the best advice that specifically like for photography that I always give young people, because I went to it's like a training center, I guess they would call it a school, but it was one of those schools where they advertise on TV at like 3 o'clock in the morning, where you can learn computer animation and video this and fashion photography, and it was just a waste of money. You know, I went for 6 months and spent like $6,000. This was back in like 1991. So I kind of, most of the stuff that I learned, I taught myself. And so I always tell younger people, you know, if you must go to school, I always just recommend to take like a workshop or something to learn the basics of digital photography. I think it's also really important to also learn film photography so that you can really get a grasp for lighting. It's one of my biggest frustrations now that I've been shooting for so long, is that I don't really retouch anything, and I think I get criticized for that sometimes, but I spent so many years shooting film where it was, you had to rely on your intuition. You didn't have, you know, the opportunity of shooting 5,000 pictures and then fixing them later. Like, you had a roll of 36 and you had to get it right, so you had to really feel your way through it, make sure that the lighting was right and everything. So I think it's beneficial for photographers to, even if it's just one class where they give you, you know, Pentax K1000 and you have to actually develop your stuff and just do it that way. And then, excuse me, get a internship, you know. And if you do that for a year or two, even if you're just sweeping the floors, I feel you're going to learn more doing that and not have to pay than you would actually going to school for like 2 to 4 years or whatever the program would be. And I wish that I would have done that instead of the path that I took, because there's just so much that you can kind of learn from doing it on your own. And other than that, it's just network. You know, networking is like the key. Like, if you don't have your networking skills down, it's going to be really difficult for you to navigate through the whole process, because there's so many people competing to do the same thing. And by networking, I mean establishing a real connection with someone, because so often people want to promote networking as, oh, hi, I'm so-and-so, here's my card, I'm going to go to a networking event and, oh, let me buy you a drink. But I feel like that comes off very phony and fake. So I always like to just really get to know people. Not that you have to have like a best friend in the person that you're networking with, but really take the time to just strip all that stuff down and be in the moment with that person so that you come off being more sincere. And those connections will be more sustainable as you go, throughout your career.
All right, that sounds really good. So before we wrap it up, I guess the biggest thing that you've taken in that's had a big aspect on who you are and who you've become?
I would have to say making the decision to move to New York, really. There were a lot of things that I did that were big before that, but I think energetically, creatively, like moving to New York was what really kind of just cracked my world open to the point that it was like the opportunities were endless. And that's what I feel like if you move to a place like New York and you can survive here and actually make a living in what your career path, I think that gives you a certain sense of power that will sustain you as you're moving forward. So for me, yeah, the move here was huge.
All right. Thank you very much.
Cool.
That's a wrap for this set, and definitely have to check out your work. I'll definitely put all the I'll get all the links and everything so people can find you and get in touch with you. And thank you again.
Cool.